She'd spent the morning in silence, scribbling notes no one cared to read. But when she finally spoke, the commander's face turned pale, and the room realized they'd just heard the voice of someone who'd changed history. Captain Maria Ghost Delacroix had been stationed at Fort Bragg's Special Operations Medical Command for exactly 16 weeks. At 5 feet 5 inches with jet black hair always secured in a regulation bun and piercing green eyes that seemed to see through walls, she moved through her records management duties like smoke through shadows. Her hands organized classified files with surgical precision. She processed after-action medical reports with the focus of a sniper, and she maintained the kind of invisible presence that made hardened special operators walk past her desk without a second glance. To the elite medical officers and decorated combat veterans, she was nothing more than clerical support, efficient, silent, and completely beneath their notice. The operators knew her only as a fixture in their administrative landscape. The file clerk, when they needed medical records retrieved, records girl, when discussing bureaucratic necessities among themselves, or simply ignored entirely when real operators were talking. None of these battle-tested warriors had bothered to dig into her background, her previous deployments, or the missions that had forged her into the silent professional who managed their paperwork. She existed in their peripheral vision, someone who kept their medical files organized so they could focus on their next life-or-death assignment. Captain Delacroix's daily routine was as predictable as clockwork and twice as reliable. Pre-dawn arrivals before the compound stirred to life, systematic review of classified medical incident reports from global operations, strategic positioning where she could observe without being observed, and flawless administrative support that kept the medical command functioning like a well-oiled machine. Her competence was unquestioned, her discretion was absolute, and her presence had become as natural and invisible as the shadows she seemed to inhabit. But assumptions can be lethal, especially when they're made about people whose true history is buried beneath layers of classified operations and operational security. Welcome to Silent Salute, where we discover that the most dangerous voices in history often whisper from the corners we ignore. Before we reveal this incredible story, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from today. And if you believe that the people who change the world are often the ones no one bothers to notice, hit that subscribe button to support our mission. We're honored to share these extraordinary stories with you. The Joint Special Operations Medical Conference was 3 days away, bringing together the most elite combat medics, special operations surgeons, and battlefield medicine experts from every branch of the military. These were the medical warriors who saved lives under enemy fire, who performed surgery in bombed-out buildings, and who carried wounded operators through hostile territory when extraction seemed impossible. The 5-day conference represented the pinnacle of military medical expertise and combat experience. Captain Delacroix drew her usual assignment for the conference: records management and administrative support. Her job was what it had always been: organize classified medical files, coordinate logistics for top-secret medical briefings, ensure that sensitive documents remained secure, and provide the invisible infrastructure that allowed elite medical operators to focus on sharing life-saving techniques and combat experiences. Among the conference's most distinguished attendees was Brigadier General Marcus "Reaper" Stone, a legendary special operations commander who had led medical evacuation missions in the world's most dangerous war zones. Stone's reputation was built on impossible rescues, leading teams into enemy territory to extract wounded operators, establishing field hospitals under artillery bombardment, and making life-or-death medical decisions that had saved hundreds of American lives. His presence at any medical gathering meant the discussion would involve the most classified and dangerous medical operations in military history. General Stone entered the main briefing room for the opening session, his experienced eyes scanning the assembled medical elite with the tactical awareness of someone who had survived countless firefights. His gaze swept across the gathering: special operations medics with multiple combat tours, surgeons who had operated in caves while under enemy fire, and the support personnel who made such critical conferences possible. His assessment was professional and routine until his eyes found the corner workstation where Captain Delacroix was organizing classified medical files. Stone stopped moving entirely. His battle-hardened composure cracked like armor hit by artillery. He stared at Captain Delacroix with an intensity that could cut through steel, as if he was seeing a ghost from his most classified operations or witnessing something that defied everything he thought he knew about administrative personnel. The opening session began with presentations on the most dangerous medical operations in Special Forces history: combat surgery under enemy fire, medical evacuations from denied territory, and life-saving techniques developed in the world's most hostile environments. Captain Delacroix established herself in her familiar corner position, taking notes that everyone assumed were routine administrative documentation. Her presence was so understated that most attendees forgot she existed within minutes. The first day covered the kind of medical operations that existed at the intersection of medicine and warfare: emergency surgery performed while under sniper fire, battlefield amputations conducted during artillery bombardments, and medical evacuations where doctors fought their way through enemy lines to reach wounded operators. These weren't theoretical discussions. They were after-action reports from medical operations that had saved American lives in places that didn't officially exist. Captain Delacroix continued her note-taking throughout each presentation, her handwriting steady despite the graphic descriptions of combat medical operations that would have traumatized civilian medical professionals. To casual observers, she appeared to be recording meeting minutes or tracking administrative details. But General Stone, who had been watching Delacroix with growing intensity since his morning recognition, seemed increasingly troubled by something he was witnessing. During the afternoon break, Colonel Jennifer Hayes, the conference's chief medical officer, approached General Stone with obvious concern about operational disagreements that had emerged during the morning sessions. "General Stone," Colonel Hayes began, "we're encountering serious conflicts among our medical teams about the effectiveness of several emergency procedures that worked in laboratory settings but failed catastrophically during actual combat operations." Stone absorbed this information with the gravity of someone who had seen medical failures cost lives. "Colonel Hayes, which specific procedures are generating the most controversy?" "Primarily our rapid trauma response protocols for penetrating chest wounds during active firefights. Our medical research suggests these procedures could save operators who currently die from treatable injuries, but our field medics report that the protocols are impossible to implement while taking enemy fire." Stone contemplated the challenge with the weight of someone who had made similar life-or-death decisions under impossible conditions. "Colonel Hayes, sometimes the most valuable insight comes from someone who has actually implemented these procedures while fighting for their life." Colonel Hayes surveyed the briefing room, evaluating the assembled medical expertise. "General, everyone here represents the absolute peak of combat medical experience. If our collective knowledge cannot resolve these implementation failures, I'm not sure where additional perspective could come from." Stone's attention drifted toward the corner where Captain Delacroix maintained her quiet documentation. "Sometimes, Colonel Hayes, the most critical expertise sits in the shadows, waiting for someone to recognize what they're actually looking at." The second day focused on the operational failures Colonel Hayes had identified, the deadly gap between medical theory and battlefield reality. The discussions revealed painful disagreements between medical researchers who developed life-saving procedures and combat medics who watched operators die because those procedures couldn't be implemented while under enemy fire. Captain Delacroix maintained her corner position, continuing the same methodical documentation that had characterized her entire conference participation. But General Stone's focus remained fixed on Delacroix's note-taking process, as if he was waiting for something specific to happen. The afternoon session became emotionally charged when Dr. Robert Martinez, a leading trauma surgeon, presented research on advanced hemorrhage control techniques that showed remarkable success in controlled environments but had failed during field testing in combat zones. "The medical data is absolutely clear," Dr. Martinez explained to the assembly. "These hemorrhage control techniques can prevent exsanguination in 70% of penetrating chest wounds when implemented within the critical 4-minute window. But field medics report that the procedures require fine motor control and sustained focus that becomes impossible during active combat." Master Sergeant David "Tank" Rodriguez, a special operations medic with 6 combat deployments, offered a different perspective. "Dr. Martinez, with all due respect, Your laboratory can't replicate what it's like to perform delicate medical procedures while bullets are snapping past your head and your patient is screaming for his mother. The disagreement highlighted a deadly reality in combat medicine, the chasm between life-saving medical innovations and the brutal chaos of battlefield implementation. Both perspectives carried the weight of American lives, but the conflict seemed impossible to resolve without perspective from someone who had actually bridged that gap under the most extreme conditions. As the debate intensified, Captain Delacroix looked up from her note-taking for the first time during the entire conference. Her movement was almost imperceptible, but General Stone noticed immediately, and his entire body tensed, as if preparing for incoming artillery. "General Stone," Colonel Hayes said, recognizing the deadly impasse that had developed. "Do you have recommendations for resolving this implementation crisis?" Stone weighed his response with the careful consideration of someone who understood that wrong decisions in combat medicine resulted in body bags coming home. Then he made a decision about information that had been classified at the highest levels. "Colonel Hayes, sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from someone who has actually solved these problems while American operators were dying in their arms." Stone looked directly at Captain Delacroix, who had returned to her note-taking but was clearly listening to the discussion with the focused attention of someone who had lived through similar debates with deadly consequences. "Captain Delacroix," Stone said, his voice carrying across the briefing room with the authority of someone who had commanded men in life-or-death situations, "would you be willing to share your perspective on the implementation challenges Dr. Martinez and Master Sergeant Rodriguez have been discussing?" The briefing room fell into the kind of absolute silence that occurs before explosions. Every combat veteran in the room turned toward the corner where the quiet file clerk had been taking notes for 2 days. Most attendees seemed shocked that the general had even acknowledged the administrative support, let alone solicited their input on life-or-death medical procedures. Captain Delacroix looked up from her notes, and for the first time since the conference began, her administrative mask slipped slightly. Her green eyes met General Stone's, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition that carried the weight of shared experiences in places where American operators had fought and died. "General Stone," Delacroix responded quietly, "I believe the implementation failures stem from procedures designed by people who have never tried to save a life, while someone was actively trying to kill them." Her voice was calm and controlled, but something darker lurked beneath, an edge that suggested she had personal experience with the deadly realities they were discussing. Dr. Martinez responded with obvious skepticism. "Captain, while I appreciate your observation, these procedures were developed through extensive research with input from experienced field medics. The medical principles are sound regardless of environmental stress factors." Captain Delacroix's response revealed knowledge that no one in the briefing room had expected from the quiet file clerk. "Dr. Martinez, your medical principles are indeed sound, but combat implementation requires accounting for tunnel vision caused by adrenaline spikes, loss of fine motor control during sympathetic nervous system activation, auditory exclusion that makes communication impossible, and the cognitive degradation that occurs when medical personnel are simultaneously returning fire while trying to save a life." The clinical precision and combat specificity of Delacroix's response hit the briefing room like an IED blast. She wasn't speaking as a file clerk offering theoretical observations. She was demonstrating intimate knowledge of combat physiology that could only come from personal experience in firefights where American lives hung in the balance. Master Sergeant Rodriguez leaned forward with obvious interest and growing respect. "Captain Delacroix, that's an extraordinarily detailed understanding of combat stress physiology. What's your background in field medical operations under hostile fire?" Captain Delacroix seemed to be calculating how much classified information she could reveal, understanding that her response had already exposed more combat experience than anyone had expected from her administrative role. "My previous assignments involved medical operations that required implementing life-saving procedures while engaging hostile forces," she replied carefully. But General Stone, who had been watching Delacroix's response with obvious recognition, was willing to provide more context about what the conference was actually witnessing. "Dr. Martinez," Stone said, "Captain Delacroix isn't offering theoretical perspective on combat medical implementation. She's someone who has actually developed these integration techniques, while saving American lives under conditions that would break most people. The revelation hit the briefing room like a direct artillery strike. The quiet file clerk they'd been ignoring for 2 days was actually a combat medical operator with experience that probably exceeded the combined field experience of most conference participants. Colonel Hayes stepped forward with obvious respect and curiosity. "Captain Delacroix, if you don't mind my asking, what specific types of medical operations required that level of integration between life-saving procedures and active combat?" Captain Delacroix's answer provided insight into operations that most military medical professionals pray they never encounter. Combat medical operations in denied territory where traditional evacuation wasn't possible, casualty collection under direct fire, and classified medical missions where operators had to fight their way to wounded personnel and keep them alive while fighting their way out. Dr. Martinez, who had initially dismissed Delacroix's perspective, was beginning to understand that he was speaking with someone whose practical experience far exceeded his research background. "Captain Delacroix," Dr. Martinez said, with genuine respect replacing his earlier skepticism, "would you be willing to describe the specific physiological challenges that we should be accounting for in our procedure development?" Captain Delacroix's response demonstrated the kind of brutal understanding that comes from actually implementing medical procedures while people are shooting at you. Combat medical implementation requires procedures designed for medical personnel operating with tunnel vision, loss of peripheral awareness, compromised hearing due to gunfire, elevated heart rates that affect fine motor control, and the psychological stress of knowing that taking too long to treat one casualty might result in additional casualties. Laboratory procedures that work perfectly in controlled conditions become completely impossible when implemented by someone who's simultaneously trying to save a life and stay alive. Her explanation revealed understanding of combat medicine that integrated physiological research, psychological trauma, tactical requirements, and practical implementation challenges in ways that could only come from personal experience in firefights where split-second medical decisions determined whether American operators lived or died. General Stone, who had been observing Delacroix's contribution with obvious recognition, decided to provide additional context about what the conference was witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stone announced to the assembled medical experts, "you've been working alongside someone whose combat medical innovations have directly saved American lives in some of the most classified and dangerous operations in Special Forces history." The statement hit the briefing room like a thermobaric explosion. The quiet file clerk they'd been taking for granted was actually someone whose combat medical contributions had saved American operators in places that didn't officially exist. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Captain Delacroix with obvious amazement and respect. "Captain, your understanding of combat medical integration is unlike anything I've encountered in 6 deployments. What specific operations were you involved in that developed this level of expertise?" Captain Delacroix's answer reflected the complex and often classified nature of special operations medical work. "My previous assignments involved providing medical support for special operations teams in denied territory where traditional medical evacuation wasn't possible and medical personnel had to function as both combat medics and fighting members of the team." Colonel Hayes was beginning to understand that Delacroix's perspective could resolve the implementation failures that had been costing American lives. "Captain Delacroix," Colonel Hayes said, "would you be willing to work with our medical teams to redesign these procedures in ways that account for the combat stress factors you've described?" Captain Delacroix accepted the expanded role, understanding that General Stone's recognition had revealed expertise that could save American lives in ways that had never been possible through laboratory research alone. "Colonel Hayes, I believe we can develop procedures that maintain the life-saving effectiveness of your research while incorporating the practical requirements for implementation while under direct fire." Over the remaining days, Captain Delacroix transitioned from her cover role as routine administrative support to active leadership in procedure development sessions. Her combination of advanced medical knowledge and combat experience created solutions that bridged the deadly gap between medical theory and battlefield reality. "What Captain Delacroix is demonstrating," General Stone explained to the conference participants, "is combat medical expertise that comes from actually implementing life-saving procedures while fighting for survival." Her operational experience provides the missing link between medical innovation and keeping American operators alive. Captain Delacroix worked with medical teams to redesign trauma procedures that maintained life-saving effectiveness while accounting for the physiological and psychological stress factors that characterize combat medical operations. The procedures we developed, Captain Delacroix explained to the assembled combat medical experts, required understanding that combat medics aren't just medical professionals. They're warriors whose primary mission is saving American lives, but whose secondary mission is surviving long enough to accomplish that primary mission. Her redesigned procedures included combat-resistant medical techniques that remained effective when performed by personnel operating under extreme stress, simplified decision algorithms that functioned when cognitive processing was compromised by combat, and integrated medical tactical procedures that allowed medics to save lives while maintaining fighting capability. Dr. Martinez, who had initially questioned Delacroix's perspective, became one of her most dedicated collaborators. Captain Delacroix, your approach to integrating life-saving effectiveness with combat stress factors has completely revolutionized how I think about procedure development. You've shown us that the most effective medical innovations are those designed for the brutal reality of their implementation environment. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was particularly influenced by Delacroix's understanding of combat medical psychology. Ma'am, your experience has taught me that successful combat medicine requires procedures designed for medical personnel who are simultaneously fighting for their lives while trying to save other people's lives. The combat medical procedures that Captain Delacroix developed were eventually adopted throughout Special Operations Commands, establishing new standards for combat-tested medical effectiveness. Her methods influenced military medical training worldwide and enhanced the survival rates for special operations personnel globally. But perhaps Captain Delacroix's greatest contribution was demonstrating that true medical innovation required integration of theoretical research with operational experience from personnel who had actually implemented life-saving procedures under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The story of Captain Ghost Delacroix became legendary in special operations medical communities, shared with new operators as an example of how extraordinary combat expertise often hides behind routine administrative roles. Her example reminded combat medical professionals that the most valuable insights often come from people whose true experience and capabilities remain carefully concealed behind support assignments. The most important lesson you can learn here, instructors would tell new special operations medics, is that exceptional combat medical expertise often comes in unexpected forms. The person organizing files in the corner might be someone who's saved more American lives under fire than anyone you'll ever meet. Years later, when Captain Delacroix transitioned to other classified assignments, her legacy lived on in the combat-tested medical procedures she'd developed and in the understanding that true medical excellence often requires maintaining operational security about combat capabilities and classified experience. Her story reminded everyone that in special operations medicine, as in war itself, the most dangerous assumptions are those we make about people who seem to fit perfectly into support roles, because the most exceptional combat medical professionals are often those who choose to hide their extraordinary life-saving capabilities behind routine administrative responsibilities. Captain Delacroix's quiet voice had revealed not just individual expertise, but a broader understanding of how the most exceptional combat medical professionals contribute to developing life-saving innovations that bridge the gap between medical theory and battlefield survival. Her willingness to share operational experience through procedure development demonstrated that true leadership continues long after combat assignments end. The moment when General Stone had asked for Delacroix's perspective had lasted only seconds, but its impact continued for years, reminding everyone that extraordinary combat medical capabilities often hide behind the most administrative appearances, and that the people we notice least may be the ones with the most important contributions to make to saving American lives. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever discovered that someone you knew in an administrative or support capacity actually possessed extraordinary combat medical experience that they kept hidden? Have you encountered people whose quiet professional demeanor concealed remarkable life-saving capabilities under fire? Tell us in the comments about the moments when you realized you'd been working alongside someone whose combat medical expertise exceeded your own understanding. And if you believe that the most exceptional combat medical professionals are often those who don't need to advertise their capabilities, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every story reminds us that extraordinary combat medical abilities often hide behind administrative roles, and that the people we notice least may be the ones with the most to teach us about saving lives under fire. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll discover another incredible tale of hidden combat expertise and unexpected revelation.